International Allegory in Post-colonial Literature, organized by the Department of English Literature, the English and Foreign Languages University. It's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce to you the speaker for today, Dr. Donovan S. Braud. Dr. Donovan S. Braud is Associate Professor of English and Coordinator of the Great Books Program at Oakton Community College in Des Plaines, Illinois. He received his MA and PhD from Loyola University, Chicago. He participates in student study abroad programs and faculty exchanges for the Illinois Consortium of International Studies and Programs. Welcome to you, sir.
Thanks. Can you hear me without? Can you hear me okay without this? All right, thank you. I prefer just to project rather than to speak. If you can't hear me, just wave your hands and I'll try to project louder. Also, some of my students tell me sometimes that I have a tendency to speak a little bit fast. I tell them, no, you're just listening too slowly. So if I'm going too fast, also wave your arm, jump up and down, say something, and I'll try to slow down a little bit. In this presentation, I will trace the salient points of the debate that began in the pages of social text in the late 1980s, and which still resonates to this day, while offering my own contributions to the argument from a perspective of pedagogy rather than high theory. So disappointed graduate students who are expecting high theory, you can take off now, I won't hold it against you. I'll also end up with some examples from post-colonial texts, as well as one text from the American literary canon. Now, the debate that I'm referring to was centered on the interpretation of so-called, well, at that time, so-called Third World literature, and was initiated by Frederick Jameson's essay, Third World Literature in the Era of Multinational Capitalism, in 1986. Ajiz Ahmad responded to Jameson's argument in Jameson's Rhetoric of Otherness and the National Allegory in 1987. And the debate continued in the works of Gayatri Spivak, Radhakrishnan, Haynes Horn, and EFLU's own Madhava Prasad, among others. The debate I refer to is, of course, interpreting post-colonial texts as national allegories. The principal elements of Jameson's argument center around his claim, and this is his main claim. He states, all third world texts are necessarily, I want to argue, allegorical, and in a very specific way. They are to be read as what I will call national allegories, even when, or perhaps I should say particularly when, their forms develop out of predominantly Western machineries of representation, such as the novel. Now, he elaborates this further by stating, third world texts, even those which are seemingly private and invested with properly libidinal dynamic, necessarily project a political dimension in the form of a national allegory. The story of the private individual, destiny, is always an allegory of the embattled situation of the public, third world culture and society. Now, a few corollaries follow from this central argument. The first is that the libidinal is to be read as the political, or Freud is to be read as Marx in Jameson's language. And secondly, the third world intellectual or post-colonial intellectual is always a political one. Now, there are other elements of Jameson's essay, but these are the most important ones for the purposes of post-colonial literary pedagogy, especially when positioned from a Western perspective. Ajiz Ahmad's response to Jameson is manifold, but his principal arguments are, first and foremost, that Jameson is totalizing. Ahmad states that in Jameson's essay, difference between the first world and the third world is absolutized as an otherness. But the enormous cultural heterogeneity of social formations within the so-called third world is submerged within a singular identity of experience. Now, the experience that Ahmad speaks of is the experience of colonization by Western powers. This experience notion serves to flatten differences among nation-states that were formerly colonies, a cultural reductionism that Ahmad finds untenable. He claims that this theory, Jameson's theory, reduces us, and here he positions himself as one of the third world intellectuals that Jameson makes his argument about. This theory reduces us to an ideal type and demands from us that we narrate ourselves through a form commensurate with that ideal type. To say that all third world texts are necessarily this or that is to say, in effect, that any text originating within that social space, which is not this or that, is not a true narrative. It is in this sense, above all, that the category of third world literature, which is the site of this operation with the national allegory as its metatext, as well as the mark of its constitution and difference, is, to my mind, epistemologically an impossible category. Now, following from this claim, Ahmad critiques Jameson's own argument as either a fallacy, right? All third world texts are this or that, or the law of the father. You must write like this if you are to be admitted into my theory. Ahmad also criticizes the concept of nation as deployed in Jameson and points out that Jameson deals with a limited availability of texts, namely those published in the English language from metropolitan centers, which leaves out whole segments of literature produced in languages that European and American scholars are traditionally not familiar with, such as Urdu, which is Ahmad's own particular exemplar. Now, Ahmad's critique of Jameson's interpretive theory was the first in a long string of scholarly responses that attempted to provide a general theory of post-colonial writing just at the time when that particular category of literature was coming into prominence in Western colleges and universities. Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak's strategic essentialism in Can the Subaltern Speak is perhaps the most famous, but Radhakrishnan and others also contributed to the discourse. Now, within this critical debate, there's a curious event that happens. This curious event is the way in which Ahmad elides the central interpretive strategy of the allegory when he uses the phrase this or that. The allegory seems to have been diminished in his argument. Its only appearance is when he claims, and rightly I believe, that the allegory is not the exclusive domain of non-Western forms of literature. Further commentaries on theories of the allegory are virtually dropped until EFLU's own Madhava Prasad thankfully picked it back up on the question of a theory of third world literature. And in his title, Third World is in parentheses, which will be obvious the reason why from his extensive quote that I'll show you in a minute. Now, Prasad critiques several of the authors who comment on the interpretation of post-colonial literature, including Jameson, Ahmad, Ramachandran, Spivak, Guha, and Horn. Prasad's own contribution to the debate is to refocus it on the importance of the nation-state as an organizing principle for literary studies. This is pertinent to pedagogy, especially because of the way in which many linguistic and national literatures are organized in college and university departments globally, although the national boundaries are not the exclusive and exhaustive organizing principle. For example, English literature departments offer courses on American or British literature. And my own course here this semester at EFLU is entitled Contemporary Indian Fiction. So I'm guilty of this too, right? Centering it on the nation state. Now, like it or not, the nation state, which is here figured as a linguistic and political boundary, is how we often categorize literary study. Even when we attempt to figure literature as a transnational phenomenon, the boundaries of nations are discursively present in the form of an obstacle to be overcome. So, how is this national configuration related to an allegorical interpretation? Now, Professor Prasad is worth quoting at length here, so there's a couple of slides with his quote. If the institution of literature is closely bound up with the history of the nation-state, there is no reason to take, as Jameson does, the predominance of private, libidinal preoccupation in the literature of advanced capitalist nations as indicative of a loss of that capacity for a collective expression which, it would seem, distinguishes third world literature. Another way of thinking about the differences between these two categories has to be found. The concept of national allegory that Jameson has introduced can be a useful component of such a rethinking. But first, it has to be freed from its mooring in an Orientalist paradigm, as Ahmad recognizes, which some Marxist theory has shared with the dominant intellectual tradition. The argument in this case would be not that third world literature is more expressive of the political realities of this world, but that for historical reasons, its critical focus is on a collective social reality and more than on, say, an individual's existential crisis. And further, that even the literary representations of existential crises in the third world context cannot be read in isolation from the national collective framework. What this means is that there cannot be two distinct theories of literature, one specific to the third world and the other to the first world. Essentially, the argument is that works of literature, whether post-colonial or not, can be read as allegories, but must be read as allegorical not in terms of a totalizing and orientalizing third world, a term which has been replaced by the equally problematic post-colonial in contemporary literary theory. Rather, these works of literature must be read within a specific national context that is attuned to the historical and ideological framework of the nation in which they were produced. Now, before offering some insights into the pedagogical hurdles that we have to jump over in order to guide our students through allegorical interpretations in specific context, it might be helpful to look back at the origins of allegorical readings to see where some crucial slippages may have been made in the critical discussion so far. Allegory, in the strictest sense, is a form of metaphor, specifically symbolism, where an entire work, right, not just one element of work, not just a symbol that repeats as a motif, but the entire work can be read as representing something else. In the contemporary period, that is most often abstract ideas, right, like nation, political ideologies, or classes of people within a particular nation. However, that's not where allegory starts. Allegory originates in the medieval Christian biblical exegesis and finds its fullest formation in the field of literary studies in Dante Alighieri's letter to Can Grande della Scala. In this tradition, there are not two levels, literal and allegorical. Rather, there are four levels of reading a text, one of which is literal and three of which are allegorical. The first is, obviously, the literal, in which case the words on the page are read as a straightforward story. The second level is typological, where the narrative refers to events in the life of Jesus. The third level is tropological, which is sometimes called moral, depending on which textbook you're reading. And this tropological level parallels the narrative events to the state of the human soul. Lastly, there is the anagogical level, which parallels the narrative to events in the Christian conception of the eschaton, or the final events in what's called salvation history in the Christian tradition. This refers to the second coming of Jesus, the apocalypse and end of the world as we know it, the salvation of the righteous, and the damnation of the wicked. For the medieval readers, all of these levels are present at once. Any text can and should be read with these four levels in mind. Now, keep in mind, in the medieval tradition, you were firmly embedded in an almost uniform Christian culture in Europe. So most of the texts that were produced during the long medieval period were produced with a somewhat religious, in most cases, and obviously religious in many cases, frame of reference. Now, obviously, Jameson has removed the Christian religious connotations and replaced them with a political one. However, that is not all Jameson has done. By claiming that all post-colonial or third world texts are allegorical, he implies that they must be read on the allegorical level. This removes the polysemous quality of texts and forces them to be read for their underlying political meaning rather than on multiple levels, including the literal level, at once. Psychological aspects, the literal story on the page, these things seem to disappear when you're reading for a specifically political, allegorical meaning, as implied by Jameson's argument. Now, to return to the polysemous spirit of medieval interpretation, but not its specifically Christian character, I suggest that texts can and should be read on multiple levels at once, and along with Professor Prasad, those readings must be grounded within specific nation-state histories and ideologies. Now, furthermore, I suggest that there are two possibilities for finding allegorical interpretations. One is suggested by the text in question when considered in its milieu. Now, this is always available, right? You can do some background reading on the time period and the culture in which a text is produced, along with reading the actual text itself. The second area for finding allegorical interpretations, and this might be heresy for some literary scholars, is one suggested by the author. Now, this may not always be available, right? The author might be dead. Each of these approaches presents its own unique challenges when teaching literature, and not all of these levels of polysemy can or should be read at once for the same reason. In literary studies, one of our underlying assumptions is that there are degrees of separation, if you will, between the living, breathing writer who produces a text and the